This is Dave Talks Comics, and I'm Dave. Welcome to the podcast. I'm going to be talking about some comic books and definitely some cartoons. No comic book conventions this time. I don't know if there's been any comic book conventions, except for online. There have been some online, and actually there's one I could talk about that happened, I don't know, a month or so ago. Maybe a month and a half ago. I'm not sure. Anyway, all past episodes of this program can be streamed or downloaded from the program's website, which is davetalkscomics.com. In addition to the program's website, this podcast can also be found in a number of places where podcasts can usually be found, like iTunes, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. You can find my notes and what I have read at davetalkscomics.net. Might mention some spoilers. I haven't read anything that's terribly recent. I've been reading stuff from the 30s through the 80s, maybe a little more recent than that. I'm not looking at the list right now. I've certainly watched some programs that are more recent than that, but even then, they're not new programs. So I'm just saying there might be some spoilers. So first, let's see. First off, I should mention I haven't recorded a program since May of this year. It's been about 4 months? Yeah, 4 months since I last recorded a program. I don't know what it is. I've been working from home, and you'd think I'd have more time, but I haven't been reading more. And I haven't been doing very many podcasts. It's just, I don't know what it is. It's just weird. I guess I need that variety. I'm missing that variety in my life of traveling to the office and coming home. And I don't know. I wasn't doing a ton of podcasts before the whole working from home thing started, but I was doing them more frequently than I am at the moment. Maybe this will be the beginning of something new, but I'm not about to hold my breath on that. So I want to talk about what I read first. So I continue to read Terry and the Pirates. This is this comic strip that started in late 1934. And it ran for decades, but the section that I'm reading is the section that was done by the creator, which only ran until 1946. So just over 12 years worth of comic strips. I have all the collections. I'm in the midst of reading the second collection. Each collection covers about 2 years. In fact, the first one's a little over 2 years, and then after that, I think they're all exactly 2 years. So I'm almost halfway through the second collection. I'm up through October. I'm into early November of 1937 at this point. So I have a little over 9 years worth of the strips to go. I've read about 3 years worth of the strips at this point. Let's see, 35, 30, yeah, about 3 years worth of the strips. And I continue to read at the same pace that I usually read, which is I read a page a day. And a page will either be a Sunday strip or it will be 3 daily strips. And one thing I've noticed is that quite often that there's repetition between the Sunday strips and the daily strips. So what happens in the Sunday strips is sometimes summarized then in the daily strips, and what happens in the daily strips is sometimes summarized in the Sunday strips. I assume some newspapers must have just been getting one or the other, and that's why they did it that way. Not all the stories are great. In fact, I'd say not all the stories are great. I'd say for the most part, up to this point in the first 3 years, there's been a few flashes, a few moments that I really liked, and they usually involve Pat Ryan, who's one of the leads. The character in the title, Terry, is a boy, and Pat Ryan is his guardian, I guess you'd say. They're living in China at the moment where I'm at. They're in Hong Kong, but at times they travel to areas away from Hong Kong. I don't know if they ever make it to any other major cities or not. Shanghai, Beijing, which at that time would have been Peking, or any other places, any other major cities in China. But I don't believe they leave China. I believe the entire strip is set in China. I don't think I have anything else to say about Terry and the Pirates without getting into the details of it. I write notes every day after I read, so I read a sentence or two, sometimes more, about the page that I just read, and then those are all in my notes. And so you get quite lengthy notes on this strip, although I don't include any images other than the book images, the covers, in the posts that I do. But there are there's some really nice art in there, and sometimes it's the reproductions, it's what they have to work with, because sometimes the images in these collected editions are really nice and really well done, and sometimes they seem a bit mussed up or blurry, or I don't know if they're really that blurry, but they just sometimes not everything is really clear. Okay, so moving on. And I'm not doing these in the order that I read them. And of course, I read more than one thing at a time, so there really is no order that I read them unless I jumped a chapter here, a page there, etc., etc., etc. But the next thing that I want to talk about is Manhunter. And I'm referring to the Manhunter story from 1973-74 by Archie Goodwin and Walt Simonson. This is a story that I'd heard about for quite a while. I had seen the images of the character, but I had never read the story. A couple years back, I believe at Baltimore Comic-Con, I finally got the Manhunter, the special edition, which came out in 1999. There was also, I think, more than one reprint before that. There was a reprint in 84, I believe, which maybe I should say a little bit about this series. It ran in Detective Comics from Detective Comics 437 to 443. It was 7 chapters long. The first 6 chapters were all backup stories. They were each, I believe, 8 pages each, except for the last of those 6 stories, I think, was 9 pages. And then the last chapter in the story was a team up with Batman, and that was like 20 or 23 pages long, something like that. I believe it had been reprinted before 1984 in some form, but I think that might have been in black and white. But in 1984, DC Comics reprinted it just like they were reprinting. There's some other things that I've read that I may have talked about on the podcast, like the Saga of Ra's al Ghul and The Shadow of the Batman. So it was one of those type reprints. Shadow of the Batman reprinted the Englehart and Steve Englehart and Marshall Rogers Batman run. It was one of those types of, but it was all in one volume because it wasn't that long. I mean, it was 8 times 6, which is 48. It was, basically less than 90 pages, or about 90 pages total. So they reprinted it in 84. Now, when they reprinted it in 84, they had it recolored by Klaus Janson. And that's the same, and that's what they reprinted again in 99. Now, the difference in 99 is that not only did they include that, there's also a text piece by Archie Goodwin, which also appeared in the 84 reprint, and that appears at the beginning of the 99 edition of it. And then there's also a text piece by Walt Simonson at the end of the book. And then just before that, there is a story written. It was written and drawn. It was written by, let me see, how do I put this? Okay, so once the original story of Manhunter was done, they weren't going to do anything else with it. And there's a reason why, and I won't go into that right now. But they didn't want to reprise this story. They didn't want to bring this character back. As far as they were concerned, that is Archie Goodwin and Walt Simonson, there was no more stories about Manhunter. Now, one of the interesting things about Manhunter is that there were clones made of Manhunter. So some of those clones have shown up in the intervening years. But the original character of Manhunter, Paul Kirk, has not made any appearances since then. It's always been clones if you've seen anybody that looked like Manhunter. At least I believe that's the case. At least through 1999, that was the case. So Manhunter was this guy who had been a crime fighter during World War II. It was actually a comic book that was written and drawn by Simon and Kirby. And I'm blanking on Simon's first name. Jack Kirby, of course, and Joe Simon. Joe Simon and Jack Kirby did this comic book. It was a feature in Adventure Comics, ran for about 20 issues, I think, something like that. And then it disappeared. And then in the early 70s, so roughly 25 years later, Archie Goodwin and Walt Simonson brought it back. But it's a very different version of the character. I mean, basically, it was set in the present at that point, and what they said was that he had been almost killed. He had been saved at the last minute by this organization called the Council. They had given him, they had healed him, but they had kept him in a frozen stasis for 25 years. And unknown to him until he wakes up, of course, they had cloned him. And so there are these clones of him. And then he discovers, of course, that the Council they say that they're on the side of humanity, but they're actually after their own. They've all got their own designs. And he decides that he can't abide by what they're doing. There's a couple other characters who come into this who help him out. There's an Interpol agent by the name of Christine St. Clair. There's the last master of ninjutsu, a guy by the name of... Oh, I'm blanking on his name now. Let's see. I have the book right here. Let's see if it mentions his name on the back. It does not. Okay, I'm going to have to open it up then and see if I can find the page. This is Thrilling Stuff. The page where... No. Okay, anyway. So there's a ninja, there's an Interpol agent, there's Manhunter. It's a very good story. And considering the time it came from, it's amazing. I mean, there is nothing else from that era that I would put in the same, from the early 70s that I would put in the same. I mean, this is like early Bronze Age comic book stuff. This is definitely not of the Silver Age. This is of the Bronze Age. And it probably falls in the same category as something like, although it's not category in the sense that it's early Bronze Age, something like Conan, something like Jerry Conway's work on Spider-Man, those sorts of stories. But it's a very good book. And I'm probably going on a little too long about this. Anyway, you should try and find it. And I actually went out and I bought some of the original issues, which were not inexpensive. I didn't get them in great shape, so they didn't cost me too much. But I paid about $8 to $10 a piece for them. And the thing, of course, that I notice is that they don't have the coloring job by Klaus Janson that the reprint editions do. So I would really recommend getting the reprint editions because they're much better. I also bought a copy of I was interested in learning as much about this story and about this as I could. And so, and I've written up notes about the extras in the Manhunter Special Edition. But I also bought the Modern Masters Walt Simonson. I had to buy a digital copy because I couldn't find a paper copy for less than like $100. It's out of print. But you can buy digital copies from Tomorrow's. And I think that was like $6. And I'll probably get back into that and read some more of that because there's other articles in there that I'd like to read. It's a long interview with Walt Simonson. And there's a chapter in there about Manhunter and about Archie Goodwin. And then I also bought back issue 64, which has an article that's about 7 pages long about Manhunter. Unfortunately, that seems to pretty much just summarize everything that I found in the extras in Manhunter, the special edition, and in the Modern Masters volume on Walt Simonson. So there really wasn't any new information on the 73, 74 version of Manhunter, but they do include in that the last like 2.5, 3 pages of that article are about the legacy of Manhunter. In other words, the appearance of some of the clones and other characters who have gone by the name of Manhunter, none of which I've read. I haven't read any of that. This was really my first experience with Manhunter. Although, I mean, Manhunter did appear briefly in All-Star Squadron, I think in All-Star Squadron number 31, but I don't recall if he appeared. And there was actually 2 Manhunters in there. I don't recall if they appeared anywhere else. The one thing that I forgot to mention that is in the special edition is, okay, so I was talking about how Archie Goodwin and Walt Simonson didn't want to do another Manhunter story. But then at some point in around 1998, Archie got an idea of what they could do, and they started talking about it. They were real excited about it, but they both had a lot of other things to do. Walt never really got around to drawing the story. And then Archie died in 1999. Now, what's the timing on this? Now, wait a minute. This doesn't make sense, because if this volume came out in 99, when did he write and draw this story? Let me see. What does the indicia say? Yeah, it says 99. Well, he must have done this pretty quickly then. Anyway, there's another story, a follow-up to the Manhunter story, but the way it's done is done completely silent, with the exception of sound effects. There are some sound effects, but it's a follow-up to the Manhunter story. And I think it's very good. It does have a different look to it, even though it's also drawn by Walt Simonson. It's not... It has a very different look to it. The original Manhunter story, it felt like they were just packing so much into it, and the panels were just pushed so close together, things would spill over from one panel to the next. And you don't get that in here. They're all kind of definite, distinct panels. But there are pages that are filled with lots of panels. I mean, have like 10, 12 panels in them. Not every page. There's some pages where it's only like 2 or 3 panels, but then there are others that have lots of little panels. It's good stuff, though. It's good stuff. Anyhow, if you can find Manhunter, the special edition, I think it's not that hard to find, and I think you can find it for a reasonable price. It's definitely, and I think it has been reprinted since 1999 as well. Definitely worth reading. Definitely worth picking up, especially if you like espionage type stuff. They travel all over the world. They're in Nairobi. They're in Zurich, I think it is. It's somewhere in Switzerland. I think it's Zurich. They travel to Japan. They travel to Australia. The parts with Batman in the final chapter take place in Gotham. Can't remember all the other places where it takes place, but it's a good read, and definitely worth it. That back issue 64, not so much. The Modern Masters, if you're really interested in Walt Simonson. Anyhow, moving on. I've still reading Ikigami. This is this 20 or 60 chapter story. It's broken up into 20 stories, each 3-part stories that set in this futuristic type, well, not futuristic, but dystopian type situation in Japan. And I know I've talked about this before on the podcast, so maybe I don't really need to go into details. Maybe you should just look back or check my notes to see what the story is about, or what the stories are about. You have both a ongoing story throughout them all, and then you have all these little episodes. So each story has its own self-contained story, as well as the ongoing story about this one character who's in every story. And so in the last 3 months, I've read 3 more of these episodes, a book and a half, and I've just started on the 12th story out of 20, as I said. And this is something that I've read before. I have the first 8 books. I read them all probably about 10 years ago. Something like that. It may have been a little more recently than 10 years ago, but not much. Maybe 8 years ago when I read the last one. There's still 2 more that I need to get, and they're out there, and don't cost that much, and so I've been kind of putting off getting those last two. The weird thing is that I was telling my mother about this, my mother who's 80 years old, my mother who also encouraged me to read comic books when I was a kid, and she also read some comic books, but she's never really shown any interest in any of the comic books that I read. And she sounded interested, and so I gave her the first volume, and she read it, and now I've given her the second one, and she's reading that. So I'm sure she's not reading it in the same level of detail that I am, but it still fascinates me that she's interested in this, and it's going to push me, I think, to buy volumes 9 and 10 sooner than I otherwise would. Another series that I am rereading is Xenozoic Tales. This is a series from the late 80s to the early 90s. There was only 14 issues. It was done by Kitchen Sink Press. I believe that there was some follow-up to it. The writer-creator is Mark Schultz. I think I talked about this a little bit before, but it's a another dystopian future. This is much farther in the future. It's supposed to be about 450 years in the future. There are dinosaurs now. There are very few humans. The two main characters are named Jack Tenrek and Hannah Dundee, and the story begins basically when Hannah travels from her city, which is called Wasun, to the city by the sea, which is where Jack lives. And Jack and Hannah are a real contrast. They're both very different. She is much more interested in the past, interested in what happened, interested in learning as much as she can, interested in doing what she can to make life better for humanity, what's left of humanity. Whereas he seems to be much more of a person who thinks that humans need to learn to accept the world the way it is and not try to push things as much. There are 14 issues in this series. It kind of reads like an anthology series in the beginning, but if you read it carefully, you can see that they're building things, that things go from one story to the next. So there's all these little stories, but there are things that are mentioned that happen in the previous stories, and you can see things building. At this point, I've read up through issue 11, which is about as far as I think I've read. I don't remember reading issues 12, 13, and 14. I might have read issue 12. 13 and 14 I'm not so sure about. One of the other distinctions is that Xenozoic Tales is one of the only two comic books that printed a letter from me back in 1991, I believe, in issue 11, which is the one that I just finished reading about a week ago. I'm enjoying the reread very much. I think I may be enjoying it more than I did the first time around. I don't remember this sense of continuity. The other thing is that when I read it the first time, I discovered it when issue 10 was out. So issue 10 was the first issue I read. I bought the other issues I could find at the comic shop. Then I had to order the other ones. And at that time, you could actually order them from Kitchen Sink Press, which of course doesn't exist anymore. But I ordered them from Kitchen Sink Press. I don't believe 11, 12, and 13, 11 through 14 weren't out at that point. I bought 11 off the stands. I might have bought 12 off the stands. I don't recall exactly when I got that. I know 11 came out in early 91, and I'm not sure when 12 through 14 came out, but I think the last one was something like 1994. Originally it was a quarterly series, but then by the end it was coming out once a year, if that. There have been reprints, but it's interesting because there are usually at least 2 stories in every issue. Most issues have 2 stories. I can think of one case. I think there's one issue that has 3 stories. And you also need to read Death Rattle number 8, which had the original Xenozoic story. But those early issues, the stories kind of jump around. They're not all in chronological order. And then there are also the backup stories. Now, the backup stories were written by Mark Schultz, who also would draw the story in the beginning of the book. But he handed over the drawing the drawing to somebody else, to Steve Stiles. And with the exception of the reprint volumes that Kitchen Sink Press did, and they did 3 volumes that collected issues 1 through the Death Rattle issue plus issues 1 through 4, then issues 5 through 8, and issues 9 through 12. 9 through 12. Yes, 9 through 12. Those are the only places those are the only collected editions that include the backup stories. So you've either got to read the original issues or you've got to read the Kitchen Sink collected editions to get the backup stories. Now, issues 13 and 14 had not been reprinted until the early 2000s, and as far as I know, there are backup stories in those, drawn by Steve Stiles, written by Mark Schultz, but they did not include the backup stories in those. And I do feel as though, I remember not being as impressed by them, and it's probably because it's a completely different drawing style. It's a much rougher look. It's not as fine-lined. In some of my notes, I compare Mark Schultz artwork to Wally Wood, to Al Williamson's work back in their EC days. And you can definitely see an evolution of his style as the book progresses. And so the way that it looks in issue 10 and 11 and even 9 is not the way it looks at the beginning. And I think they're all good. They're all wonderful. But I can see how at the time I was rather seduced by Mark Schultz's artwork, and Steve Stiles just looks, it's so very different that I don't think I was as interested in those. Yeah, I don't think I was. And so I just didn't see the importance of those. Maybe you can read the series without the backup stories, but I really do feel as though, first off, they are well drawn. It's good visual storytelling. And they are written by Mark Schultz. So I'm not entirely clear on why they haven't ever been reprinted. But that's the way it is. Now, I did buy the Modern Masters volume from Tomorrow's. Well, I didn't buy it from Tomorrow's. I found it on eBay. I got it for a reasonable price, basically for cover price when you factor in the shipping and the tax. On Mark Schultz, the Modern Masters volume on Mark Schultz, and there's a big section in there on Xenozoic Tales. I have not started to read it yet. I want to wait until I've read all 14 issues, and then I will read that. And there's actually one section on Xenozoic Tales, and then there's another section on all the spin-offs from Xenozoic Tales. At one point I bought, and I still have, they even had Xenozoic Tales candy bars, and you could get a box, kind of like a cigar box. I still have it in my desk drawer, and I keep stuff in there. It's not in perfect shape. It's not completely beaten up, but it's not in perfect shape. But it's one of those little bits of memorabilia. I think I have a poster or two from Xenozoic Tales. I think I have a Kitchen Sink Press catalog that had an image drawn by Mark Schultz for Xenozoic Tales. And I have a number of collected editions. I have the Kitchen Sink Press collected editions. I also have the volume from Flesk, Xenozoic, which of course only collects the Mark Schultz stuff, but it also has extras. And so that's a fun read. I'm glad I'm finally getting through to this, because I tried to start going through this. I actually read Death Rattle I reread Death Rattle number 8 like 2 or 3 years ago. And then I put it down, and I just did not get back into Xenozoic Tales. I think I wasn't sure how to do it or what to do. And then it finally, during this COVID time, I finally been able to get back, finally just took a shot at it. And I've stuck with it. I'm reading like 3 issues at a time, 4 issues at a time. And, so actually I'm bouncing back and forth between Ikigami, between manga and an indie, and at the moment the indie is Xenozoic Tales. So once I get done with this story of Ikigami, the 12th episode, as they call them in that series, I'll be back to read the last 3 issues of Xenozoic Tales, and then at some point I'll come back and I'll read The Modern Masters on Mark Schultz. And those are the things that I'm reading more recently. Now, a month or two ago, I was also reading Captain America. I'm still on this read-through of J.M. DeMatteis, Captain America. I want to call it a reread, but I only read part of it originally. I have all the issues now. I think at the time I got them, there still is no collected edition for all those issues. But they are available all on I think they're available through Comixology. I'm not certain on that, but I know that they are all available on Marvel Unlimited. So actually, that's how I'm reading it. Although I pull out the issue and I'll read the letters page and the Marvel bullpen bulletins and see what kind of information I can get from there. And I usually put all that information in my notes. So the most recent issues I've read have been 284 and 280. It started around 258, I think. And basically beginning when J.M. DeMatteis started writing it, and up through, my plan is to read up through, I think it's 301, which he, I think, co-wrote with Mark Gruenwald, I think. I'm not certain on that. But it's a climax of sorts of the story, and that's as far as I want to get. So I've read 284, 285 recently. I also read Annual 6 and 7. Annual 6 is a favorite of mine, although the artwork, I think, got somewhat butchered by Vince Colletta. The penciler was Ron Wilson, and he's done some beautiful work, but the job that Vinny Colletta did over his pencils, I think, is atrocious. It really would have. It's a good story. I think it could be a better story. And Annual 7 was kind of interesting because it picked up on stuff from the Project Pegasus story. The more information about the Cosmic Cube. I'd never read it. I'd had it for quite some time, but I'd never read it. I think I probably just picked it up because it was a Captain America annual. I don't really remember where or when I got that. I don't think it was terribly recently. It was an okay story. I did not like it as much as Annual 6. And the next story that's coming up, which I have read, is the last of the issues that I have read before, is the 3-part Deathlock story, where Deathlock comes back from the past and clashes with Captain America, and then I think they end up teaming up together. But I haven't read that in probably over 15 years. I think I bought it probably 17, 18 years ago, those 3 issues. The only other thing that I have to mention, as I said, I have not read a ton of stuff, is that I finished off the 7th volume of the New Teen Titans by Marv Wolfman and George Perez, although not all the issues are by... They were all written by Marv Wolfman, but not all of them were drawn by George Perez. And so the first half of Volume 7 was the Judas Contract, and the second half, well, there's a 3-part story which is on basically the end of the Hive, and then there's a story that was beautifully drawn by Steve Rude. And anyhow, that's as far as I've gotten in that. I do have Volume 8. I believe there's 11 volumes. I don't know if they're going to go any further than that. But there's at least 11 volumes in this. These are these trade paperback collections of the Teen Titans. And Volume 8 finishes up the new stories in Tales of the Teen Titans. So Volume 7 ends with issue 48, and then Volume 8 is issues 49 to 58. So there's actually 10 issues. Usually there's 8 issues per collection. And then I think Volume 9 has the beginning of the 84 Baxter series. And I have most of these issues. Don't have every single one of them, but I have most of these issues, at least from those 2 collections. I have all the issues from 7. I think I have all the issues from 8. Yeah, 9, I don't know if I have all the issues from. And that's basically all the comic books I've been reading. Before I get into just a quick rundown of a couple other things, some stuff I've been watching. I've picked up on She-Ra and the Princesses of Power. I'm watching season 2. It's only 7 episodes long, and I'm 5 episodes into it, so I'll be done in a couple weeks. I'd say it's good. It's very good. It started a little slow, but I like the way it's developing. I'm curious to see where it goes. I've been listening to a podcast about She-Ra. It's about more than just this show. And these 2 people who do this podcast are fans of the original She-Ra show, which I probably saw a clip of here or there. I certainly saw episodes of the original He-Man cartoon when I was a kid, although it was more my youngest brother's thing than it was mine. I was already in my mid-teens, I think, when that came out. But I did watch some episodes of the original He-Man show, but it didn't really speak to me. I'm certainly not the target audience for this, but I think it's very well done, and I'm enjoying it. And I don't love the episodes equally, but I think there's some really good stuff running through the episodes. I've picked up Justice League Season 2. Of course, I've seen all of Justice League before. This is the Justice League cartoon from the early 2000s. I watched the first disc, which is the first 3 stories, 6 episodes or 3 stories. I think the best one of those is probably the second one, which is the one with the Mazo, and Lex Luthor, which is called, I'm going to have to look it up because I cannot remember what it's called. But the third one was the one with Dr. Destiny. I think that was To Dream, or let's see, I'm clicking. Okay, so the third one was called Only a Dream, and the first part of that was pretty good, but the second part of that I thought they definitely didn't stick the landing on that. Oh, Tabula Rasa, that was the name of the second story, the one with Amazo and Lex Luthor. I thought that was a really good one, especially the ending was amazing. It was really good. And the first story was okay. I thought it was a little overdone. It was called Twilight. It involves Darkseid and Apocalypse and Brainiac. Takes place, of course, in outer space because they travel to the Justice League travels to Apocalypse. It's a decent story. I think it's a little overstuffed. I think there's a little too much in it. So I'm 3 episodes into that. I have plans to continue, but before I get back to that, I want to get back and watch the last 5 episodes of season 2 of Young Justice, which I have never watched before. I've watched the first 15, but I have never seen the end of season 2. I am now 24 episodes into UFO Robo Grendizer. This is a cartoon I saw as a kid, although I doubt that I saw more than the first season as a kid, and I'm sure I didn't see all the episodes. I was like 7, 8, 9 years old when I saw this, something like that. Probably 8 or 9 years old. And I saw this, when I saw it was in French, and it was called Goldorak. I have a bootleg of this, which has English subtitles. It's in Japanese with English subtitles. This is an anime series, of course. The subtitles are not the best. I get the impression that they got the subtitles from another language edition, either another subtitled edition in another language, or maybe directly from Japanese, and they just fed them into a translator because some of the subtitles don't make very much sense. Usually I can figure out what they're saying, but sometimes it just sounds reads really weird. The series has gotten better as I get into it. Still, it isn't great stuff, but I like it. I enjoy it. It's fun seeing the series again. It's fun seeing how the show develops. I have found a very good website for information on this. The website is in French, but you can use, if you're using like Chrome like I do, then you can, it will translate the website. You have to, click on the, whatever it's called, the link or whatever, to translate the website in English. Now, it's a couple things. First off, some of the translations are a little wonky. There were things like in French, the possessive, like if you're talking about somebody's, his wife, it won't actually be masculine. The word his wouldn't be masculine, it would be feminine. And so we should translate it. Something like that doesn't translate right. The other thing is that they changed the names of the characters in the French version. And so all the names are going to be different. So you'd have to figure out what the names are. But they do have complete synopses of all the episodes. They have a list showing you what the key episodes are, and there's a lot more information in there. So it's, if you interested, and it is available on DVD in French, but unfortunately they do not have English subtitles, and it's also not Region 1 DVD. And actually, I'm not sure if it's DVD or if it's Blu-ray, when I think about it. But if you can read French and you're interested in 1970s anime, especially, sci-fi anime, it might be worth it. The other series that I'm still watching on Netflix, actually I have the DVDs now as well, is Knights of Sidonia, and I've watched up through episode 8 of the first season. I've watched the first season before. I even podcasted about the first season before. And I think that was when I found out that I had to take extensive notes on some of these shows in order to really grasp everything, because things just go by so quickly. And so I will usually watch these episodes at least twice. The first time I'll just watch them straight through, maybe make a couple notes, but just watch them straight through. And then the second time I'll go through and I'll be pausing it much more frequently and making notes about what's going on and who's who and all that, because my brain could not process everything on a single watch. It's just, there was a lot happening. I would get people mixed up. I would think this person was that person, and didn't this person die? No, that was somebody else. Or wasn't it this person who gave this guy this thing? Nope, it was somebody else. And then there were flashbacks to the past and figuring out who's who and who's related to whom. It gets very complicated. But I think it's an excellent series, and the animation is gorgeous. There is a manga of it which preceded the anime, but I've only read the first volume. It's not as fine-lined or as pretty as the anime is, but I don't know. It's been a while since I read that first volume. I mean, at least 2 or 3 years, I would say. The other thing that I'm reading, well, let's see. I want to talk about a few things that I'm reading right now, and then I'm going to wrap things up. Right now, since I finished off Manhunter, I have started to read Marvel Team Up. There's a story that I had heard about, and I found all 4 issues of it. I think at Heroes Con a few years ago, like 2-3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, I'm not sure. And that is the story that ran through from Marvel Team Up 82 to 84. And 82 is a team up with Black Widow. Then 83 is Nick Fury. 84, it's 82 to 85. Yes. 82 is Black Widow, 83 is Nick Fury, 84 is Shang-Chi, and then 85 is all 3 of them are in it. And I believe the Silver Samurai and maybe the Viper, formerly known as Madam Hydra, are in it as well. So I've only read the first issue of it so far, and I thought it was pretty good. I enjoyed it. It's written by Chris Claremont. I don't recall. Well, the inks are by Steve Lealoa in 82. The pencils are by Sal Buscema, I think. Yes, I believe so. But I'm not sure if that's the creative, the artistic team on the other 3 issues of this run. But I really like their work. And Steve Lealoa did the art on that 3-issue run of Spider-Woman that I read early this year, which also featured the Viper and the Silver Samurai. As I mentioned before, I'm in the midst of reading Ikigami Volume 12 right now, or Episode 12. I've read the first part, so I've got 2 more parts to go in that. And the other thing that I'm reading, and this is a book about comic books, this is something I've been reading for probably more than a year now, and I pick it up and I put it down, and it's easy to pick up and put down. And this is the American Comic Book Chronicle. This is a series by 2 Morrows. It has a year by year. There's and it's not any one comic book company. It's all of comics. But of course, the major focus is on DC and Marvel. There's a chapter devoted to each year. Each chapter is about 30 pages long, and they talk about some of the important things that happen in comic books. And there'll be like little sections that are devoted to each thing. So it's broken down. It's like there was just a section on, let's see, I'm in 1976. There was a few sections in there on Jerry Conway coming to DC and some of the books he did for DC. And I'm blanking on some of the other things. I'm just completely blanking. Yeah, I'm blanking. But anyway, I'm about halfway through that chapter, and the problem is it's easy to pick up and put down because all these little sections are kind of self-contained. But there's a lot of good information in there, and I also have the volume on the 1980s, so I've got a lot of reading ahead of me. So I've read 1970 through halfway through 76. So the only other thing I wanted to mention was that I actually got an idea for a comic book story, and so I mean, this is just like within the past few days, and so I started to write down my ideas. It's a DC comic story. It involves the Freedom Fighters, and it involves a crossover, at least in the beginning, involves a crossover with the Legion of Superheroes, a subset of each team crossing over, and the Legion of Superheroes coming back to the past and then bringing some of the heroes who would later be part of the Freedom Fighters into the future, into the 30th century, from the 20th century to the 30th century, from World War II to the 30th century. I think from 1942 is what I have in my notes. And then they come back to the past. And so I don't know how far I'll go with this. All I have really are broad strokes of the story. I don't really have any character moments. Maybe I should pick up the Quality Companion and read about some of those characters like Doll Man and Phantom Lady and Uncle Sam and see if I can get some ideas about what sort of characters, because all I have really are plot ideas at this point. I don't really have any character ideas at this point. But so that's basically it for this episode of Dave Talks Comics. I'm not sure how long I've been talking, but I think I've been talking long enough, and I don't know when I'm going to do another episode. Hopefully it won't be 4 more months or more. As always, you can find this podcast at davetalkscomics.com, as well as wherever podcasts are usually found, places like iTunes, Apple Podcast, and Stitcher. You can keep up with what I've been currently reading at davetalkscomics.net and what I've been watching at smallscreenscrawls.blogspot.com. I usually update those blogs on a daily or weekly basis. Links to Small Screen Scrawls can be found at davetalkscomics.com or davetalkscomics.net under the Other Blogs header on the right-hand side of the page. If you're looking at it on a desktop, on the desktop layout, if you're looking at it on an iPhone or some other device like that, there might be a drop-down list where you could find a link to the other blogs. And there's even my old comic book blog, Reading for the Trade is there too. Anyhow, it's .com for the cast, DaveTalksComics.com for the cast, .net for the notes. If you have comments or questions, I can be reached at DaveTalksComics@gmail.com, on Twitter @DaveTalksComics, or leave a comment on my website. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening.